Marcy, and I'm the president of Dominican University of California. And this is a very special evening for all of us. I have a little bit of breaking news, which is different, I know, for our usual conversations as we start our leadership lecture series. And I know the breaking news has not been our favorite thing for all of us in the last few months, but this is good news. Many of you know the Dominican is celebrating its 130th year, and we're very proud of that fact. But one of the things we're equally proud of is the fact that we have never stayed in one place. We've always evolved and transformed to meet the needs of our students and our community. You see that in the Leadership Lecture Series. You see it in the results for our students. And it turns out we are, in fact, very good at that. We just received the American Council on Education's National Institutional Transformation Award for the entire nation. We're really excited about it. It's about the difference that we're making in our students' lives. That highly diverse student population, one of the most diverse in the country, that is now also one of the most successful at graduating, successful at moving from the lower socioeconomic quartile to the top. It's really exciting to see that work recognized and to know that we're making a difference in students' lives. Now, along with students, I think we're making a difference in the lives of our community through conversations like the one we're going to enjoy this evening. And we couldn't do it without our community. We couldn't do it without our sponsors. We have some amazing sponsors. They're all a part of this fabric in Marin and in the Dominican neighborhood that we so cherish. We want to thank them, and I want to call them out individually so you get a sense of just how much of a community comes together around the Leadership Lecture Series. First of all, you know that this lecture series has been going on for over 16 years. And we are in partnership with Book Passage. So Elaine Petrocelli and Bill Petrocelli have been amazing partners throughout. We also have some wonderful sponsors, including our lead sponsor this year, Fairview Capital Investment Management, which is a boutique wealth management and investment advisory firm headquartered in Green Bay. They are also very active in our community, and Annie Matheson, the CEO and founder, is on our board, and we're very pleased about that at Dominican. Our program is also supported by our diamond sponsor, Christine Christensen. Christine received her MBA from Dominican, so we think she might have learned a few good things there on her way to becoming one of the top 1% of real estate agents in very competitive Marin County. She is currently with Vanguard Properties. Tonight's gold sponsor are our good friends at Bank of Marin. For 30 years, Bank of Marin has been a leading business and community bank in the San Francisco Bay Area with 25 offices across 7 Bay Area communities. They offer commercial banking, personal banking, wealth management and trust services, and legendary service to customers and investment in its local community. And I can speak from experience that Bank of Marin is Dominican's bank. We're proud of that, and they've been incredibly responsive and great partners throughout our relationship with them. Our silver sponsor this evening is Dominican's Women Leadership and Philanthropy Council, a giving circle that inspires women to lead, collaborate, and contribute, focused on supporting Dominican programming to develop women as philanthropic leaders and women engaged in our community. What a perfect mission for Dominican in general. So on behalf of the university, I hope you join me in thanking our sponsors for their generous support, for making sure the Leadership Lecture Series continues, even in the midst of the pandemic. And to introduce tonight's speaker, I welcome Russ Colombo, the CEO and president of Bank of Marin.
Welcome. I'm Russ Colombo, president and CEO of Bank of Marin, and I'm pleased to introduce our guest this evening. John Meacham is a renowned presidential historian, Pulitzer Prize winner, and a #1 New York Times best-selling author of numerous books, including Destiny and Power, American Lion, and Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power. A member of the Council on Foreign Relations and of the Society of American Historians, Meacham is a distinguished visiting professor at Vanderbilt University. He is a contributing writer to the New York Times Book Review, a contributing editor of Time magazine, and has written for the New York Times op-ed page, as well as the Washington Post. Meacham is also a regular guest on Morning Joe and other broadcasts. Today, he will discuss his latest book, His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope, revealing a portrait of civil rights icon and longtime U.S. Congressman John Lewis. John is joined in conversation with Claiborne Carson, a professor of history at Stanford University and director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. Since 1985, he has directed the Martin Luther King's Papers Project, a long-term project to edit and publish the papers of Martin Luther King Jr. Please join me in welcoming John Meacham and Claiborne Carson.
Thank you so much. And this is a particular treat for me and an honor because Claiborne Carson is kind of the Mick Jagger of the world in which I live, and is a iconic figure in the research and storytelling world of both civil rights and more broadly American culture. And so I'm honored to be anywhere near him. The easy joke here is that I am Ed McMahon to his Carson, which I promised I wouldn't say, but now I have. So I will do what I can. But always happy to be in your part of the world, even virtually. So Professor Carson, honored to be here. Can I ask you a question first?
I would like to just respond to that. Whenever words like icon and are used, I keep reminding people I'm retired, I'm not dead yet. So
I long to be called iconic, and no one ever has. I'm in no danger of that. So I would embrace it. I would take it and run.
Yeah. Okay.
But you all should know, Professor Carson's first book was a history of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which John Lewis chaired for 3 years. And I would just, in fact, don't mind starting here. When did you first meet John Lewis?
Well, for me, as a 19-year-old, the March on Washington was my first protest. I had gone through high school and the first year of college, and I had heard about these heroic people, young people in the South, leading the sit-ins, the freedom rides, and I wanted to know more about them. And I finally got a chance in the summer of 1963 to go to a student conference in Indiana, National Student Association. And there I happened to meet a young man by the name of Stokely Carmichael, who was there representing Howard University. And one of the things I remember him saying is that, why do you want to go to the march? You know, why don't you get involved in the real movement in Albany, Georgia or someplace? And I had a hard time telling him that this was the bravest thing I'd ever done in my life. I didn't even tell my parents I was going. So I was a long way from Albany or Birmingham or the Delta of Mississippi. But when I got to the march, the person I wanted to see was John Lewis. And you can imagine why. He was the youngest, by some measure, actually. And I think all of us were waiting to see, what he was the spokesperson for this young group of people who were doing remarkable things. And we were certain that he was not going to simply say what the other leaders were saying. He was going to say something more militant, and he did. And they tried to censor his speech, I found out later. I remember sitting down with him and going through that when I was working on the SNCC book. And he talked about how he had used the word revolution. And the young people in SNCC weren't afraid of that word. And it did upset some of the other speakers at the march. And he had to tone it down a bit. Talked about marching through the South like Sherman did, which wasn't going to get a lot of friends. And but even in its slightly toned down version, it was the speech that to me indicated where the movement was really going. And when he talked about we want to vote like one man, one vote is the African cry. It is our cry to also. And we want our freedom. We want it now. There was that insistence. And at that time, obviously I didn't even know him. But I think one of the things I noticed about your book is that you describe him as a saint.
Mm-hmm.
And, I know we could get into that discussion, and it's, I think there's some justification, but I also think that it maybe makes him less of the human being. And I know you deal with that in the book, and I'd just be interested in maybe starting at that. And because certainly I did not see him as a saint in 1963.
Sure. Now, I have a very clear argument about this, at least clear to me anyway. I don't see sainthood as turning someone into a supra-human figure or a superhero. Saints in the classical Christian tradition and wise men and wise figures from the Judaic tradition is simply to point out that they led exemplary lives that set them apart from the ordinary run of human experience. And we have saints' days. We have icons. We have celebrations and commemorations, not to alienate people with a story of off-putting virtue, but hopefully to inspire and to illuminate, because it was a human being who managed to achieve such great things. And I wrestled with this for a long time. I'm far from the first, as you know well, to come to this designation. Time magazine called him a saint in 1975. So I came late to this party. I like to think that's a mark of good history, is that you return to things. And he always resisted it, as you know. I was struck by Jim Lawson, who, when I laid the case out to him, and he began the conversation very much the way you did, which is, okay, sort of, all right, prove it, essentially. Dr. Lawson, of course, spoke much more eloquently than that, but that was the gist of what he was saying. And if, in fact, you have a figure inspired by the gospel who was willing to sacrifice personal well-being, even unto death, in order to demonstrate the efficacy and importance of sacrificial love within time and space, that is a test of sainthood. And was its sanctity itself means set apart. And I do believe John was set apart. And one of the reasons this is so much fun for me to talk to you, and I think one of the reasons I'd love to hear you talk about this too, one of the things that must be fascinating about the sphere of history where you spend most of your time is, unlike a historian of colonial America or a historian of Civil War America or of emancipation, you can't call, those folks can't call up James Madison and Frederick Douglass and double check something. And because of your work, you have been able to speak to the original cohort of the people who made the history that you're so importantly chronicling. But I talked to Lawson about it 2 months ago, I guess. It was we knew John was dying, but he was not yet gone. And he acceded to it. He said, I think there's much truth in that. And by the classical definition, you're on safe ground. And it's funny, my colleague and friend, Eddie Glaude at Princeton, has pushed back on that. And wonderfully, and I have Eddie's permission to tell this story, he changed his mind. He read the book, he watched the funeral, and he came back and said, I was skeptical, but now I see. I'm not sure he quoted Amazing Grace and saw me in that light, but I'm going to tell the story that way just because it's a little better. Saints aren't saviors. Saints aren't gods. They're exemplary human beings. And one of the things that I found so fascinating about John is he fully understood the power of narrative and the power of story. He went back to Montgomery, he went back to Selma, he went back to Birmingham, he went back everywhere. You were there with him, went back to India. And he did it not to aggrandize himself, but to keep the story alive. And I think what's so interesting is that's fundamentally a biblical instinct, right? The Bible has precepts, but it has more story. It is a narrative document of exile and deliverance. And my sense is that he learned that power of witness and doing things that other people could see or hear from the man over your right shoulder there, from the example of Gandhi. So I'd love to hear, if you could, talk a little bit about how the example of Gandhi intersected with the more traditional gospel in the Black freedom movement in the 50s and 60s.
Well, I think that we see that need to separate, some people out because they are capable of extraordinary things, and I would say that about all the people who joined the Freedom Ride. They knew when they got to the Deep South that might be the end of their lives, and in fact, other people told them that. Martin Luther King told them that this was likely to end in their death, and he didn't want to come. And so I think that in that sense, whatever it was about James Lawson and the group that he trained them well.
Yeah.
He made them believe that if they had this kind of commitment to nonviolence, a commitment that would lead up to, if it will take your life, you will stay committed, then that entire group, I guess, could be defined as saints. And I think the only reason why I probably resist it is it's hard for me to put me into the company of saints. It's almost like,
Right.
I knew him as the person I interviewed for a book, and knew him as a person I sat over
Sure.
and talked with him on a number of occasions where it was just really informal.
Sure.
And you kind of have this sense that saints are these
Right.
people who are not that approachable.
Right. And that's part of my goal here. I had several goals in doing this. One was actually to address exactly the entirely reasonable concern you're expressing, which is, there's a wonderful hymn in my tradition. I'm an Episcopalian, called I Sing a Song of the Saints of God. And the key point is, and I mean to be one too. They didn't only live and die in ages past. There are hundreds and thousands still. And I wanted to kind of demystify sanctity, which is related to a second issue that I was trying to address in this particular moment, which was, we have millions upon millions of Americans who look like me, who profess an allegiance and adherence to a religious tradition that has much in common and is, in fact, in many ways, the same tradition that John Lewis professed and in which he grew up. And he practiced what he professed to a remarkable degree. I And most of the folks I know do not do that. We might profess with a certain passion when we're so moved, but we fall so short on the practice. And as Jefferson understood, as Madison understood, as Frederick Douglass understood, he once said, there's no soil so ripe for reform than American soil. And part of that was because of the religious elements in that soil. My view is, if we're never going to legislate or drive religious feeling from political decision making and the public square. And so instead of trying to do that, why don't we try to manage it, marshal it, educate it, and bring it back, if insofar as we can, to the first principles of the Sermon on the Mount. A lot of white evangelical Christians, I live in Tennessee, they don't live far from me, are far more interested in who sits on the Supreme Court than they are on whether their lives are actually lived in accordance with the Sermon on the Mount. And I think that's been an incredibly important element in American life because of the religious support given to slavery, the religious support given to segregation, the religious support given to the subjugation of women, the religious support now given to I don't want to get partisan, but to a burgeoning authoritarian streak in the country. All of that has religious support. But John Lewis was doing what he did. The movement of which you were a part and of which you are the leading chronicler in the United States was driven by faith. And so why can't we utilize religion to illuminate and inspire instead of simply dividing and conquering? And my sense is that religious feeling may be one of the key elements if we are, in fact, to overcome the reflexive tribalism that affects us now so deeply, but has always shaped us. The third reason I wanted to do it is I loved him. I knew John did far less time than you did, but I realize now it was 28 years. We met in November 1992, and it was the last election in 1992 was a Georgia Senate runoff. As you know, on election nights, the currency of power, if you're a politician, is not to be seen. You're supposed to be off doing priestly things, and you're really probably just eating cheese cubes in another room watching TV and not knowing anything, but you want to look as though you're important. Well, John and Lillian were just standing in this ballroom, and I went up and started talking to him, and it began this conversation that we really had off and on for those 28 years. And I want to explain one of the big disagreements we had, and then see whether you side with me or with him. I fear I know the answer. John Lewis believed, and I believe Dr. King believed, but check me on this, obviously, that the beloved community, the kingdom of heaven on earth, could in fact be brought into being within time and space. That there were circumstances that could bring justice down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I don't believe that. I'm more of a Niebuhr guy on this. I think President Obama is also on my side on this. I think that history is fundamentally tragic on this side of the grave. But John and Dr. King did not, right? They thought that if our hearts and minds could be oriented in the right direction, we could in fact create the beloved community. And we argued about this all the way through. Neither one of us ever convinced the other of anything. But where do you stand on that? Can the beloved community come into being short of what Faulkner called the last red and dying evening?
I think I'm a skeptic like you. I think that you
Right.
can bring, you know, I've talked a lot about King's last book, especially during the last 3 months,
Sure.
4 months. And where do we go from here, chaos or community? And I think we can be a lot closer to the community side than the chaos side. And maybe that's enough to hope for. Just get to the point where we are civil and occasionally loving to our neighbors and fellow country people. Mm-hmm. Right now, I would accept some, what is it, 10% of the loved community?
Right.
Would be
a glimmer.
Yes, right, and you do see glimpses of that, and you do see, but I also look at SNCC itself, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and it had that, James Lawson wrote the statement of purpose, and it was this beautiful statement about how love could overcome all the divisions and bring about a better world. And yet, even within that community, there were, Stokely Carmichael and John Lewis. They struggled over the future and John Lewis was displaced as chair of the organization. So you see how hard it is to bring about, as you citing Niebuhr, not just sin, but greed and selfishness, and all of these things are part of the human identity. And it maybe if we had a number of lifetimes to live, we could maybe get closer, but it would take a real act of will. Mm-hmm. But I think, maybe like the way you view a saint, is it's something to aspire to. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the way they would put it. I wouldn't speak for John. I know that he expressed some uncomfortableness with that saint designation, but I think that he would also see that when you build that kind of community, you do bring other people closer because they can see some element of it. And one of the things that I think you're probably familiar with, there's a number of books now coming out about what I would call the voluntary religious communities that populated America in the 18th and 19th centuries, and how important they were to the anti-slavery movement. Mm-hmm. That often it was these isolated communities where they had this ideal that somehow they could, if they could just kind of separate themselves off from the rest of humanity for a little bit, they could build a community. Now, none of them really lasted some of them lasted for decades, but ultimately they all kind of gave way. But while they were in existence, they did fuel the anti-slavery movement. When you think about what it took in the 19th century to see the evil of slavery when it was so commonplace, it was such a basic part of American society. The founders were often slaveholders. Mm-hmm. And yet there were these people from the beginning, from the time of the founding, who were saying, no, this is wrong. Quakers and other groups were spearheaded this movement. So you do see that perhaps I think one of the problems with many of these communities is they tended to be homogeneous. Mm-hmm. And the real breakthrough is when you had communities which were very specifically diverse. And those were the ones that served as counter models.
It's also the millennialist impulse, as you say, to separate and almost to purify yourself so that you're ready for a reordering of reality. The separation is problematic if you're trying to reform a broad polity. And I think that's what the civil rights movement got right, it seems to me, is that the church was a base, but not the battlefield, right? It was the headquarters from which the troops went out, and it was sanctuary in a storm, but their work was not in the pew, it was in the streets and in the hearts of the country. One of the things I'd love to hear you on this, and this is, I don't think this is a controversial thesis, but it may sound that way. So I want to put it carefully. Given American history, and given both the history of slavery, the failures of Reconstruction, the rapid and remarkably resilient institution of Black codes and Jim Crow, and the durability of those laws and customs. Are you surprised that we're experiencing what we are today in the country? That 55 years after Selma, 52 years after Memphis, only my math is bad, 66 years after Brown. I'll just say my answer. I'm not surprised. I think that it's a sentimental misreading of the freedom movements of the middle of the 20th century to think that somehow or another, once the signs came down and once the registrars had to at least be a little less obvious in their suppression, I see this as a tragically sequential chapter in that story. Am I being too cynical or too negative, or do you roughly agree?
Not at all. I think Martin Luther King, one of the things that he recognized is that, well, he often used that phrase, the most segregated hour in America is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. And I think that to me is right at the essence of, we have a nation that professes religiosity, morality, and yet even in those institutions that supposedly represent that, they have been strictly segregated. It's as if, just think of the history of this country, particularly in the South. Black people and white people have lived together for 4 centuries. And yet, in those moments where they voluntarily decide to worship the same God, supposedly, they can't seem to get it together.
Mm-hmm.
And, when I go into a church, I often find it's interesting, those churches, those Black churches that do have a few white members, and some of them have been going there for years. You see that at Ebenezer and other churches, and vice versa. You see some predominantly white churches where Black members have been going there for many years. But those are the oddities.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that when we think about all the institutions of American life, the military, the schools, universities, corporations, Congress, they are all more integrated than the local church around the corner.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not even, and the segregation is not just that it's strongest on the black-white issue. In other words, it would be not that unusual to see, say, a Hispanic person at a predominantly white church, or but even that's rather unusual.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the black-white divide, there's something special about that, and I think that's one of the reasons why for Black Americans, and I don't speak for all of them, but one of the things that's so hard is that whenever something happens, and it could be, the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, things like that. And the first thing you say is, what if that person had been white? What if that person had been middle-class white person? With our current president. Can you imagine Barack Obama having a mistress, having women he has to pay off? Not when for Black Americans, we look at that and just say, what hypocrisy here?
Mm-hmm.
And you've kind of got into it in terms of just the lack of basic empathy for your fellow citizens. We have this notion we're all in it together. But you see so many manifestations. No, we're not.
No.
There are those who are going to survive, and those who are going to die, and so be it.
One of the reasons,
and that works on neighborhoods also. It's neighborhood segregation is maybe not as strong as it once was, when you would have a mob greet a Black family moving into a white neighborhood, but it's still,
sure,
it's more class-based now.
Sure. Another reason that John Lewis stands out to me is he was this remarkably hopeful figure who bore the scars of the Great Reaction, great meaning mighty, not great in a grand sense, of the state-sanctioned, largely totalitarian white power structure in my native region. And yet he had hope. He believed that next bridge could be crossed. And if there were ever a question, and I thought a lot about this, but if there were ever a question that I think he got tired of, it was, why are you hopeful? Or are you surprised we haven't come far? Because what he would say is, if you don't think America can change, come walk in my shoes. And it's one of the few answers he ever gave that tended to foreclose discussion as opposed to invite it. You know what I mean? It was sort of a knock it off, you're whining, was kind of the subtext. And I've been struck by that for years. And I finally, sort of toward the end of his life, and talked to him about it a good bit, I really do think, and I think he got this from King, this insistence that grace was possible, that God was in fact, love was in fact, as you mentioned from the Lawson statement, that love was in fact more powerful than hate. But you had to look at it from a mountaintop, not from the day-to-day slugfest of reality. And from anybody else, if I said that, it would easily be dismissed as sort of mindless patriotic hypocrisy, right? But John Lewis said it, and he was willing to die for it. And so I think that maybe this is an overly determinative biographical view, but I think one has to give credit to that view. He was willing to die for a country that continued to disappoint him in deep and fundamental ways. And yet there he was to the end, standing at Black Lives Matter Plaza. And there was no mistake that there were cameras there. You know, he and Julian understood the media very, very clearly, with an insistence that in fact justice would prevail. And I'm wondering, can you give it? Is that an essential? Is that a Kingian view of reality as well? Would Dr. King have reacted? Do you think if Dr. King, I know you probably hate this question, but if Dr. King were here, would his answers on these issues, do you think, be more or less in tune with the ones that John Lewis gave us and Andy Young has given us?
Certainly you've gotten to why they are so remarkable, is that despite all evidence to the contrary, it's all going to work out.
Right.
And that's the deepest kind of faith. I mean, if you've been beaten as many times and jailed as many times as he was, and still come out of it saying, yeah, it's gonna work out. And also wanting to, in some ways, confront it. You know, because one of the things I noticed, I traveled with him to India for the 50th anniversary of King's trip there. And I've also been to many of the cell commemorations at Edmund Pettus Bridge. And seeing him also just meet groups of students traveling through the South. And what he seems to enjoy, actually, is inviting someone he knows is on the other side of the political spectrum to come with him. And because he has the prestige that he has, he's able to get these people to go and be part of that. And you know, I'm sure that many times they go back and they vote staunch Republican. You know, it doesn't change their political outlook very much. But he seems to get some sense that at least now they see him as a person, and he sees them as a person. And the deeper change, maybe it comes, maybe it doesn't. But I think he gets a lot of satisfaction just from having that dialogue, having that interaction. And I know that for many of us, you know, that's hard, you know, quite frankly. You know, it's I think of myself, I like to have dialogue with people I see as much more conservative than I am. That's not that hard to do with the Stanford, with the Hoover Institution there. But I enjoy that. I like the intellectual work of that, and I do see a different aspect of, say, a George Shultz, who's, you know, an old friend at Stanford, and I see that they're humane individuals. They're, you know, they don't become Democrats, but they have a I guess a balanced view of things, and on some issues you can persuade them, and those are the kinds of things that I think he sees. Those small victories have to matter,
right?
And you know, just having the dialogue, having somebody come to your church somebody come to your home. And I think in a way that's where the solution has to be, that ultimately, we have to get out of our silos. We have to do the hard work of sitting down with a Trump supporter and saying, why are you a Trump supporter? And at least finding those people who are willing to have that interchange. And sometimes that happens within your own family too. So you almost have to.
I have Mississippi in-laws who are only happy when Fox is attacking me because they think that I've made it at some level. You talked about the power of the personal connection, which is obviously essential in a popular government like ours. I am always wary. Remember this, there's a great line in Tom Sawyer where Twain has Sawyer describing an evangelist who'd come to town. And the line was, the preacher was so good that even Huck Finn was saved until Sunday afternoon. So can you get to Tuesday is kind of the test. The other question I get, I'm sure you get a lot of, what would King say about X? I bet that's probably the most common popular question you get. The one I get again and again is, what kept him going? What kept Lewis going? Did his faith ever wobble? And amazingly, with the exception of the exile that the self-imposed really, but imposed by SNCC, that he went into in 1966 to 68, after losing the chairmanship about 10 miles away from where I'm sitting at Kingston Springs, when Stokely Carmichael won when John was de-elected, and there's a wonderful, one of the best lines in your important book is, you quote my middle-aged brain won't call her name right now, but a female member of the committee who said that one of the reasons that the students were disenchanted with John was that every time the White House called, John would send his suits to the cleaners and get on a plane. And they thought he was too close to power at that point. And he goes to New York and spends 2 years essentially by himself. It's one of the many biblical kind of episodes in his life. Right? John Lewis wasn't John Lewis in Pike County. He was Robert or Bob. And then like Elijah, like Abraham, like Peter, he received a different name. And the exile was not unlike that. He went into the wilderness and came back for the Kennedy campaign. One of the things that attracted me to writing about him in this way was kind of the essential, at least apparent, purity of heart and optimism. And so one of the questions you get 1,000 times a day probably, but I'm going to ask it again, is John Lewis lived. And he saw out his full sphere, his full span of years. Keeping that optimism alive. What's your best guess about if Martin Luther King had survived Memphis and had proceeded with the Poor People's Campaign and had proceeded with the anti-war work? Do you think if he had been granted his full span and had died of cancer as an elder statesman of some kind, do you think his hope would have been as strong as John's was?
That's interesting. I could answer that either way and probably convince myself that I'm right. Because I think that there was that sense one of the things about Martin Luther King was he was an intellectual. I don't think I would use that word to describe John.
No.
I mean, he was very smart, but but King was a person who thought a lot about ideas. And he was very self-reflective, in that sense. And I think that as the years went on, I think his commitments would still stay the same. But all of that took, and maybe this was true of John too, I don't know, that took a toll on his body, on his mind.
Mm.
And he was a person who would just break down and have to go to the hospital out of exhaustion, and um, so I don't think he would have made it to 90 if he had stayed.
Huh. Interesting.
I think that he would have been the type of person who either, I think there was that possibility, and that's why I convinced myself either way, that he could have just said, look, I've done this. I didn't ask for this job. In a sense, Rosa Parks made me a civil rights leader, and I got the Civil Rights Act through Congress, and it's time for me to take a rest and get away from this and become campus minister at Stanford and just write books, or a Dominican, just get away. And I think that would have saved him.
Hmm.
So it's
So
I think that intensity of the late 1960s and early 1970s had to be wearing. I mean, when I look at other people who didn't take the break that John Lewis,
Yeah.
Stokely Carmichael, and
Mhm.
people like that, the leaders of the Black Panther Party. I mean, they're you see these people right at you can't sustain that level of intensity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that I worry about with young people today, that they have to pace themselves. I have a conversation with people who are taking my online course on every Monday. I have an office hour on Zoom. And one of the things I think, I know they're tired of me hearing this, but I'm saying, be a long distance runner, not a sprinter.
Yeah.
That you think that the revolution is going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen next year. And when we were talking about the beloved community, that might be many lifetimes and many generations away. So you have to be satisfied with small victories, and you have to pace yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And because of all the pulls, I see all the letters writing to King, come and visit, come and speak here, come and do this, come and, he's getting so many demands on his time.
Mm-hmm.
And being torn in lots of different directions. And I think in some ways, John was fortunate to be able to pull himself away from that day-to-day tug of war. And I think that's why he made it to his age.
So interesting. So arguably, I'd never thought of it in that way, but arguably if he had held on against Carmichael and had been plunged into the Meredith March and been more active in the shift to the anti-war focus and the poverty focus, he would never have had a chance to catch his breath and might not have been able to finish the marathon. That's very interesting.
Yeah, one thing about movements is that the most tiring aspect of them is really not, like many people think, going out on the streets and protesting and stuff. That's, in fact, for a young person, that's kind of fun. You go out and get together with your friends, and you maybe do a few things that you shouldn't do, but it's not strenuous. what is strenuous usually are the meetings, the discussions about what to do. All of that interplay, the interpersonal conflicts.
Planning and personalities.
Planning and personalities, yes. The 60s was an endless meeting. And
you forget that. That's true. That's true.
Yeah. So I think that's something, Martin Luther King could not avoid coming to the meeting, and being the central focus of it. So that had to wear down.
There's an old story about, I remember the name Arthur Burns. He was a Nixon economic advisor. I think he was the chairman of the first council of economic advisors to a president, I think. But there's an old story about he walked into the Roosevelt room and to run a meeting, and he sat down, and a young aide said to him, "Oh no, Mr. Burns, your seat is over here. The head of the table is here." And he said, "Son, wherever I am is the head of the table." True of Dr. King, right?
He couldn't be inconspicuous in a room.
No. Take just a second, if you would, and just your sense of their relationship. My view quickly was John. If Dr. King had been a little older, it would have been a full-on father-son feel. They weren't quite far enough apart. I think 12 years. There was very much an older brother, and to his credit, I think John may have worshipped him, but he never quite committed the sin of idolatry. I think he just pulled back enough. But does that track with your sense of it?
Yeah, I think he wanted Martin Luther King to be a little bit less cautious, particularly about going to jail. One of the things that most people don't recognize about King is that going to jail was not something he avoided it whenever possible. He didn't want to go on the Freedom Ride. He, the students in Atlanta almost had to push him to join the sit-ins. Now in Birmingham, he did very famously go to jail, but he stayed there a week. For the young people in SNCC, they had a policy called jail no bail.
Right.
And because they didn't want their freedom to be at the cost of hiring lawyers, and that meant they had to bring in the NAACP. And so their view was you get a 30-day or 60-day sentence, and that's the kind of organization I got involved in Los Angeles, and the Nonviolent Action Committee. Is you got a 90-day sentence, you served your 90-day sentence, and there wasn't any complaining about it, and there wasn't any. Now I didn't actually have to do a 90-day sentence, but I risked it, and it's. But that was the rule among young people. Now it's easier for a 19-year-old or a 20-year-old to do that than someone with a family and with a job. He was a teacher. You got to be there on Sunday. So there were a lot of things that he just did not feel comfortable doing. And that was one of the things about his relationship with Ralph Abernathy. He wanted Ralph to be with him every time he went to jail. He didn't want to be there by himself. And that was understandable, because the one time he was not there with Ralph was the Reedsville jail in Georgia. And that was a horrific experience of being taken from jail in the middle of the night. And he didn't know where he was going to be taken. So he, but John, what was his arrest count? Now, toward the end of his life, he could get out by morning because he was a member of Congress.
Well, he did 40 before the movement and 5 as a member of Congress. And
Yeah.
and that's, I say this a lot, and people are kind of startled by this. I think he was in far more physical danger when we couldn't see him than when we saw him in the famous marches.
Mhm.
There
Yeah.
were there were 40 chances for the deputy or the posseman or the prison guard to kill him. And you know, you look at the stay at Parchman and just
Mhm.
so many others. Again, it's we don't think of John Lewis and the SNCC world more broadly put. Diane Nash, Bernard Lafayette, the James Bevel, the whole crew. But I think they're war veterans. I mean, Normandy and Selma have a lot in common. And
Mhm.
the Mississippi Delta and the Mekong Delta have a lot in common because of the threats they faced. And one of the things I tried hard to do in talking about these stories is not, and this is said with all love for our friends at PBS, but not wanting to turn everything into an American Experience episode, right? You know what I mean? Where there's a kind of a neat denouement, where we become a more perfect union, and then we thank our sponsors, because that's not the way history works. And to me, again, and this brings us full circle, this one of the saintly aspects of John Lewis's character was that insistence that suffering was redemptive. I don't want to suffer. I don't want to love my enemy. They're my enemy, for God's sake. Why would you want to do that? You know, but he did it. And he walked among us, and he was your friend, and I was honored to know him. And if one human being can do it, then maybe the rest of us can try to.
That's a nice note to end on, because I see they do want you to sell a book.
It's more a threat than a promise. You're holding this up.
Oh, you could sell my book as much as you want. But
In the Struggle, here it is. I want y'all to buy this.
Yes.
This is from a very small press called the Harvard University Press. You know, Professor Carson's had a hard time getting published, so support him. He's starting out in this academic career.
Actually, I think you sell more books in a year than Harvard has sold.
But that would be true if we sold in the high 2 figures. But I appreciate it. An honor to be with you, sir. And thank you to Dominican and to the store.
And we are so honored to have both of you with us tonight. This was such an incredible discussion. And to Dr. Claiborne Carson and John Meacham, you are 2 of the great thinkers of our time, and to be in the room, so to speak, with both of you is just an amazing experience. And to all of you who are watching, I got a note while this was going on that said that 4,600 people registered to hear this tonight. So thank you for bringing that to our listeners and our sponsors. I'm really grateful, especially to Dr. Denise Lucy, the founder and head of the Institute for Leadership Studies, because it's her vision that has brought these lectures together. And this, I remember when John was here, doesn't seem that long ago, but I think it was about Jefferson, so it was a while ago. For those of you who are here, we hope that you will know Dominican, that you will perhaps contribute. There is an opportunity to do that. These lectures are free, but the contributions are up to you. Should you contribute $50 or more, you are going to get a copy of this magnificent book. I feel like the NPR huckster, His Truth is Marching On. And one of the things that meant so much to me was the fact that John actually spoke with Congressman Lewis so much throughout the book, and that the afterword is so lovingly written by Congressman John Lewis. It's really an amazing work. So something, as you can see behind me, I have my John Meacham library, and those are just a couple of them. So this is something that you want in your library. You know, Dominican is a pretty amazing place. And next week on October 1st, Al Sharpton is going to be with us. And for his book, Rise Up, Confronting Across a Country at its Crossroads. And he is going to be in conversation with Alicia Garza, who is the co-founder of Black Lives Matter. So that is something I hope you'll, I see John raising his
I just want to say one thing. I just want you all to tell Reverend Sharpton that Professor Carson and I were much cooler than he was.
We'll be sure.
You would do that. Because Sharpton owes me. Don't you agree? I think we're much better.
I know them personally, and I have an idea they'll have an interesting discussion.
I think we will.
Carson being generous. Sharpton owes me some cigars. So
I'll remind him if I have a chance. And for those of you who are new to Dominican, I just want to tell you that this is a school that has 2/3 of the students in this school identify as racially diverse. A quarter of them are the first in their families for generations to go to college. And 80% of the students here receive tuition help. So those of you who do decide to contribute will be helping to grow this magnificent university, which is considered one of the 11 best colleges to send yourself to in California. So please come hear Reverend Sharpton. If you missed Chasten Buttigieg last weekend, please know that by registering, you can see all 3 of them for free. And to Dr. Claiborne Carson, I can't wait to get your book. In the Struggle is just, as I saw it up there, I thought, why don't I have that book? And I do have a copy of Where Do We Go From Here, Dr. King's great book. And I hope that people will order it on our website, bookpassage.com, and Dr. Carson's book, and anything else you want. But just know that in these difficult times, these 2 scholars gave me hope, and I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
This was fun, but I will remind him about the cigar.
Please do. Cigar, plural. I want a box.
Oh, okay. I'll do what I can. Thanks so much. And Dr. Claiborne Carson, I don't know how many years it's going to take before those papers are done, but I can't wait to celebrate when you start letting those of us who are not scholars know about them. Thank you both. Good night.